Good evening. From our headquarters in Kiev, you're watching the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only primetime TV broadcast that explains the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. I'm Andriy Kulikov, and this is what we've prepared for you this week.
The appointment of the Auditor for the Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. What's behind this? 1 year of disputable work by Ukraine's Prosecutor General assessed. Moldova's recent political arrests, fighting corruption or selective justice. Pat Cox, a member of the European Parliament Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, on the progress and failures of the reform of the Verkhovna Rada. NATO summit, we focus on what it means for Eastern Europe. Close look at the Czech Republic, Kremlin influence and authoritarian sentiments. The lives of orphans in eastern Ukraine, our own recent report from Avdiivka, one of the closest towns to Donetsk.
Go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua, where you can find full versions of the reports and interviews. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International. We will be back in a second with very special guests. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau, an institution that many Ukrainians really hope will be at the forefront of fight against corruption, had chosen the first of the 3 independent auditors. This is a person, according to whose assessment the head of the bureau could be fired. So the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Volodymyr Groysman, has appointed a Ukrainian lawyer and academic, Mikhailo Buromensky. He is the president of the Institute of Applied Humanitarian Research, and he has worked as a legal expert for the European Union, the World Bank, the OSCE, and some other rather prestigious international institutions. However, the law demands that a candidate has, quote, substantial work experience in the law enforcement agencies, prosecutor offices, or courts abroad, or in international organizations, unquote, which made many Ukrainians question the appointment, especially civil society activists. The fact that Mr. Buromensky was preferred over many prosecutors that are rather well known in the world is an additional cause for doubt. And as also the fact that Mr. Buromensky is member of the Presidential Constitutional Committee of Ukraine, which is headed by Prime Minister Groysman. Tonight in our studio we have an expert of the Transparency International, Oleksandr Kalitenko. Thank you for joining us. Moreover, he is not just an expert, he is an expert for the political analysis at Transparency International. But first, not about the politics. It's about the procedure.
It's about the procedure, the mechanisms.
How, to your mind, to your assessment, Mr. Kalitenko, how close to the procedure the proceedings were?
Actually, there is risk. There is a risk because Mr. Buromensky did not have the experience, the relevant experience in the law enforcement agencies abroad, actually, because he is rather theoretical person. And this is not a common practice for Ukraine to make an audit for law enforcement bodies, such as, for example, police or General Prosecution Office, so on and so forth. So that will be the first audit in Ukraine for the law enforcement body, for the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. And that's why it's extremely important to have such auditors that have such experience, because there are no procedure in the law how exactly this audit should be concluded, because this audit will be for the first time and there is no deadline for this audit, and also international candidates such as Marta Borch, for example, or Robert Storch, or Giovanni Kessler, or that persons obviously were stronger.
All right. As you have mentioned some of the other candidates, let's look at the list of those who sort of competed, although it was not actually a competition, for the position of the auditor. Robert Storch is the deputy head of the U.S. Inspector General's office in the Department of Justice. He began working as an attorney in the public integrity section of the DOJ Criminal Division and has held various roles within the organization, including senior counsel and counsel to the Inspector General. Giovanni Kessler, whom Mr. Kalitenko also mentioned, is an Italian prosecutor nominated by the European Commission at the request of civil society. Mr. Kalitenko didn't mention another rather interesting candidate, who is Carlos Castresano, and he is a Spanish prosecutor and the former head of the UN International Committee Against Impunity in Guatemala. He revealed high-level corruption in this Latin American country and brought to account ex-president Alfonso Portillo. He has been to Ukraine many times and acted as an advisor to Ukrainian law enforcement body. However, there's another very interesting candidate whom Mr. Kalitenko did mention, and this is Marta Borch, an American prosecutor with 30 years of experience, and she specializes in federal criminal defense and complex civil litigation. As a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of California, she served as chief of the Organized Crime Strike Force and chief of the Securities Fraud Unit. Marta Borch's experience in federal criminal law includes fraud, domestic corruption and bribery, or actually fight against fraud, domestic corruption and bribery, money laundering and other federal criminal offenses, and she was a prosecutor in the infamous or famous money laundering case of former Ukrainian Prime Minister Pavlo Lazarenko. Do you think that the cabinet of ministers who actually appointed Mr. Borominsky has seriously regarded any of the foreign candidates, or the agenda was from the start to take them into, to pretend that they are taken into consideration, but still to appoint a Ukrainian?
There were lack of transparency, actually, in the procedure of appointment the auditor by the cabinet of minister. We saw that there were no proper announcement on the website, in the internet. There were no proper announcement for the candidates, for the auditors.
So far, we've been talking about just one of the three auditors. Yes. And there are other two which have to be appointed by whom and how they will cooperate. Will they be able to work together, actually?
One should be appointed by a president, and another should be appointed by the Verkhovna Rada. In Anti-Corruption Committee, headed by Mr. Yehor Sobolev, there is an open contest for these auditors. And such candidates like Marta Borch, for example, or Carlos Castresano are also candidates for the auditors, but appointed by the Verkhovna Rada.
So they have a second chance?
Yes.
But shouldn't we take into account the fact that in many cases the experience gained abroad is hardly applicable in Ukraine? The conditions are so different. And what is seen as a positive feature, the foreign experience, in many cases, and we have examples of this, just does not work in Ukraine.
There was such a situation, but in that case, for example, Ms. Marta Borch, she is familiar with Ukrainian corruption.
We in Ukraine are very much used to different demos and rallies that react to practically everything that's been done and that's not been done. But in this case, I think the vigor of the protest, the vigor of the public reaction was even higher than in some other no less important cases. Why do you think the civil society has reacted so vigorously to this appointment?
Because, as you have mentioned in the very beginning, the negative audit is the reason to fire Mr. Sitnik as the head of National Anti-Corruption Bureau. And given in mind that NABU is the new anti-corruption body which is providing already some results, of course it's critical for fight with corruption to have independent NABU.
And our conversation is interrupted for some time by Skype, where we have Bohdan Kryklyvenko, who is currently the head of the office of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, and he had a chance to work with future Anti-Corruption Bureau Auditor Mr. Boromensky. What can you tell us about Mr. Boromensky? What was your experience?
Hello, colleagues. We have, during the last few years, very good experience of cooperation with Professor Boromensky in different types of cooperation. Just a few months ago, he was a member of our commission established by Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Lutkovska, for the election of the member of High Qualification Commission of Judges. And it was very good and successful experience. Then 2 years ago, also together with Professor Boromensky, we realized a very good experiment. Firstly, it was done by our office. It was a project so-called as a external monitoring of the implementation of new criminal procedure code from the point of view of ensuring of human rights in the implementation.
I actually remember that for the first time I heard Professor Boromensky's surname in relation to this experiment. That was highly publicized and seems to be a highly successful case. But go on.
We have the good cooperation on the less formal level with Professor Boromensky, and I know that all lawyers community know him very well. And what's very important for us, that external commission or how it's called, the auditors for the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, from our point of view, also have to check where with the human rights and fundamental freedoms are they secured during the activities of National Anti-Corruption Bureau.
So has Mr. Kryklyvenko removed some of your concerns?
Actually, no, because there are still no experience for the law enforcement agencies abroad.
Oleksandr Kalitenko, thank you for being on the Sunday show, and we will be back in a second. It's been a year since Mr. Yuriy Lutsenko, formerly the head of the presidential parliamentary faction, was appointed the country's Prosecutor General. And he was appointed despite lacking a law degree or background in law enforcement. On the day of his appointment, Mr. Lutsenko said that he would be in the Prosecutor General's office for 1.5 to 2 years, and immediately declared that his main task was to change the Prosecutor General's burial grounds and restore the prosecutor's office to a real advocate of the people and state, quote unquote. However, Mr. Lutsenko's work in this position raised many questions and provoked controversies. In particular, is the Prosecutor General a political figure, first of all? This should not be the case for some in such a position at a time when Ukraine is trying to move forward the supremacy of law, the rule of law, and eradicate selective justice. We have in our studio Anastasia Krasnosilska. She is an expert for Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine, And I am in two minds, whether first to show what Mr. Lutsenko thinks his major successes are, or to ask you, what are his major successes? Let's go for you first.
Well, unfortunately, we do not see any major successes of Prosecutor General Mr. Lutsenko.
What about minor successes?
Neither we see his minor successes, because if we try to remember his promises that he made when he was appointed as Prosecutor General and compare them to what has actually been done, we see that nothing has been done.
After such an introduction, let's see and listen to what Mr. Lutsenko thinks his major achievements are over these 12 months.
I report that there are dozens of corruption cases against Yanukovych and his widest circle. We have completed the pre-trial investigation against Yanukovych. They have already responded on the court proceedings for 32 former officials from the time of Yanukovych and the heads of the fictitious enterprises that worked for them. As I promised, the number of crimes solved relating to the obstruction of peaceful protests on Maidan has risen. Since the beginning of the investigations into the Maidan cases, law enforcement agencies have sent 147 indictments on 228 people to court. During my time as Prosecutor General, in these cases, 31 indictments on 70 people have been sent to court. In particular, an indictment against the former head of the capital's law enforcement, who are charged with organizing the beatings on the 30th of November and the 1st of January. As it stands, 42 people have been sent to court in relation to the Maidan cases. Since the 3rd of May, respected people's deputies, the Prosecutor General's office has started self-governing. From now on, the Prosecutor General's office can neither appoint nor dismiss any of the heads of any of prosecution units, and this is a good thing. It means that the Stalinist model for the prosecutor's office is dead. In the short time since January, the General Inspectorate has already dismissed 46 prosecutors for dishonesty and providing inaccurate information in e-declarations. Harmonizing the legal position, we took the opportunity to focus on joint investigations and joint prosecution groups from the specialized anti-corruption prosecutors and NABU, and are moving successfully in that direction. How successfully? In a year, we have handed 1,191 cases of criminal corruption offenses over to the courts.
So, Ms. Krasnosilska, why experts at the Anti-Corruption Center are dissatisfied with such a impressive list of what's been done by the Prosecutor General's office?
Let's try to analyze issue by issue. As to bring into liability Yanukovych and his cronies, there are two groups of cases against Yanukovych and Prosecutor General office. One is for allegedly betrayal of the interest of the state. This case has been filed to courts and hearings has started. In our estimation, these hearings will last for not even 1 or 2 years. As for economic crimes of Yanukovych, the ones that are connected with allegedly embezzlement of public funds, none of these cases has been submitted to the court.
What's the
even
reason,
one.
to your mind?
Well, basically what we see is that Prosecutor General office is not investigating these cases in a due way. Let's take just two examples. There have been a case against Yuriy Lutsenko, who was a close ally to Yanukovych, our former president. This case has been closed down because Prosecutor General office was inactive in this case for 1 year. Moreover, European sanctions were lifted from Lutsenko because of lack of activity of Prosecutor General office in this case.
Excuse me, I'm not a specialist, obviously, in these cases, but the fact that the investigation was stopped, does it mean that they cannot return to it?
Well, basically, they can try, and Prosecutor General office has already claimed that they will return to this investigation. But the result of in this investigation might have been recovery for the Ukrainian budget, the assets that have been frozen in the European Union. But this arrest on assets and this European sanctions have already been lifted, which means that we will not have an opportunity to seize these assets once again. Therefore, yes, for 99%, the opportunity to recover these assets, unfortunately, has been lost. Let's take another example. There have been a criminal case against Zlachevsky, the former minister in times of Yanukovych. The case against him was about allegedly illicit enrichment. However, Prosecutor General office changed legal qualification of this case for a tax crime for which not even Zlachevsky, but a legal entity connected to him paid a small amount of money, and the case has been closed, with no opportunity to bring Zlachevsky personally to legal liability for illicit enrichment, with no opportunity to recover $23 million that have been frozen in Great Britain, if I'm not mistaken.
What about the cases that have arisen during the time when Mr. Yanukovych was no longer in power?
For this 1 year that Mr. Lutsenko is in office, there have been a number of, I would say, Hollywood-style arrests of top-profile officials. However, not one of these cases has been filed to court, unfortunately. We all witnessed all this really Hollywood-style, this is the only definition I have, Hollywood-style arrests and detentions, which resulted
helicopters and all this
helicopters, all this huge assets being found in cabinets and personal residences of top-profile officials. Unfortunately, not even one indictment has been sent to court in these cases. Moreover, some of these people basically returned to their jobs in several months.
How probable it is that the next Prosecutor General will be again a political figure? Like many people say that Mr. Lutsenko is not really a Prosecutor General, but mostly a political figure, since he comes from the very close circle of current president's allies. Will the civil society, people like you, experts in anti-corruption, will, after all, the legal system and law enforcement bodies be willing to agree with another political appointee?
Well, unfortunately, we are not in a position to agree or not agree. We see that prosecutorial
Well, maybe
reform,
you are not in the position to influence it, but...
We are trying to. We called for resignation of Mr. Shokin. We were successful with that, but unfortunately, we are not satisfied with Lutsenko, who came to Shokin's place. Chances for new Prosecutor General to be also a political figure are very high. Unfortunately, prosecutorial reform in Ukraine is failed, and we see no political attempts to introduce any new version of prosecutorial reform. As far as Prosecutor General is being appointed by the parliament and his candidacy being offered by the president without any even approximation to transparent competition. As far as this practice is in place, the Prosecutor General will continue to be a political person. And we see no moves and no signs for the fact that the president is willing to introduce an open competition for the position of Prosecutor General.
Thank you very much, Ms. Krasnosilska. And Anastasia Krasnosilska is an expert at the Anti-Corruption Action Center. We will be back in a couple of seconds. The dispute between anti-corruption fighters and the President of Ukraine regarding the law which demands completing e-declarations is putting pressure on civil society, and it is still there. Petro Poroshenko has promised to create a working group to change the law, but it hasn't happened yet. That was the answer of the administration of the Ukrainian president to Hromadske. We were promised that the deputy head of presidential administration will join the Sunday show next week. So far, the issue was raised by Hugh Garelli, head of the EU delegation to Ukraine. Curbing this recent negative trend of pressure on anti-corruption NGOs requires authorities to take a firm stance. Otherwise, one could see in this a worrying trend reminiscent of past and gloomy times for the country. The same concern was raised by the well-known Pat Cox, a member of the European Parliament's Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. He was very blunt, calling the law a very bad error of judgment. More was said in our interview with Mr. Cox, who's also the former president of the European Parliament and who later became a member of the monitoring mission launched in 2012, aiming to facilitate reform and modernization in the Ukrainian Parliament. Our interview on progress and failures.
The midterm of the Verkhovna Rada's work ended in May. Society has put a lot of faith in this parliament, which was elected after Maidan. People hoped for swift changes in the work of the parliament. We haven't seen any yet. Maybe you have? What progress has there been since the start of the European Parliament's special monitoring mission to Ukraine?
I think after Maidan that the demand of the people of Ukraine is for a new democracy, a modern democracy, and a reformed state. This is a huge responsibility for the people's deputies in the Verkhovna Rada. And I think a considerable amount has been done. There is a saying that Rome was not built in one day. And when you take on the whole transformation of a society, it's a very big job. I think a good start has been made. I would give a number of examples. I think that the e-tendering system has taken away a lot of the potential for corruption which had existed to do with public tenders in the past. I think the e-declaration system brings more transparency to what are the interests of the elected members in terms of their private interests. I think this is important.
More than a year ago, the Verkhovna Rada voted on adopting your proposals as the basis of their reform. Since then, we haven't seen any concrete changes. Very often in the Ukrainian government, we see imitations of reforms and declarations, but nothing is implemented.
Well, I think the first absolute requirement is for reform to work in Ukraine. It can only be owned by Ukrainians. So I would say on the positive side, we had two pillars in our reform program. One is the administration of the parliament, the apparat, and the other is the functioning of the parliament as a political institution.
In terms of political will, in your opinion, are there any votes for your proposals in the Ukrainian parliament?
The only honest answer I can give you to that is I do not know. We have made a clear recommendation on those things, and we believe that a correctly functioning parliament should do this. These norms, cultural values, what does it mean to be elected as a parliamentarian? This is something that needs to be worked on. These are not the norm that many parliaments would accept. And so the question of the culture, the values of the individuals and the institution needs to be focused on. And I think one of the elements in this, if I could say, is the kind of work that you do or civil society does or media does.
If I understand correctly, you are quite optimistic that the Verkhovna Rada will vote for your proposals.
Look, I am not naive. So you asked me, optimistic, pessimistic. We have a duty to be optimistic because the people of Ukraine in the revolution of dignity have demanded a new Ukraine. And I think this is one of the ingredients in a new Ukraine, is to develop a strong, capable, independent parliament that follows good norms and good ethics. Foreigners cannot make Ukraine's future. Ukrainians can do. And the thing I like about the approach we have, it is respectful of the integrity of Ukraine, respectful of the independence of Ukraine, and even if I could disagree with details, the biggest point to make is this must be done by Ukrainians in Ukraine for Ukraine. And that's why I have some optimism, because things are happening, even if slowly, and much patience, because I understand change is always complicated. But I think the duty is to be optimistic. And the duty is to be optimistic for the whole of this society, because a lot of blood was spilt on Maidan. And now the time has come to spill the sweat in building the new Ukraine. And that takes sometimes many hours and lots of arguments. And we're helping in an environment to spill some sweat for Ukraine, even as unhappily people still spill their blood in the war in Donbass.
I would like to know your opinion on one more thing. It is difficult to make decisions in the Verkhovna Rada, as we have seen in previous cases where they try to trick society by making subtle adjustments. For example, the situation with e-declarations for NGOs was a small amendment within a law. How would you describe this approach to lawmaking? Because despite criticism from the West, the amendment has not been overridden.
Of course, like everyone else, I have my opinions. But I have not expressed those opinions because I work with all of the political factions. I don't have to agree with any of them, but I have to work with them. And I want to have their goodwill and work with them in a respectful way and understand that they will do the politics in Ukraine. However, on this question, I do make an exception. I think this was a very bad error of judgment. I think it is a bad law. I think it has many implications that were not properly thought about or debated. I think it's like taking a step backwards. I don't like it. I would love it to change, and I'm happy to speak in a way that condemns it totally.
Fighting corruption or selective justice in Moldova. This week there were two high-profile arrests in the Republic of Moldova. The mayor of Moldova's capital, Chisinau, Dorin Kirtoake, was charged with corruption and a number of wrongdoings, including some connected to paid parking. He is on his third term, which will expire in 2019, but now he may face 10 years in prison. Mr. Kirtoake is also one of the leaders of the Liberal Party of Moldova, which has supported strong ties with Romania. Just before another opposition politician, Yuriy Lutsenko, who is the son of former President of Moldova and former MP of an opposition Liberal Democratic Party, was also detained. What does it all mean? We also bear in mind that Moldova elected a new president last winter, Igor Dodon. Yet famous businessman and Moldova's richest person, Vladimir Plahotniuk, is also the leader of the Democratic Party, and he tries to strengthen his influence and allegedly may benefit from the arrests. My colleague Natalia Humaniuk talked to Moldovan political commentator and former ambassador of Moldova to the UN, Alexei Tulbure.
Alexei, so thanks a lot for being with us from Chisinau. And we were following two cases of the high-profile arrest with the current mayor of Chisinau and as well the politicians from the Liberal Democratic Party, Yuriy Lutsenko. In both of the cases, there were talks about the corruption in banking sphere and in some kind of municipal governance. But what is interesting that both politicians who are arrested are representing a Moldovan opposition. So really, what we need to know about those cases, can you explain to us?
Yeah, indeed, there are two cases and they should be taken separately. In case of Yuriy Lutsenko, former member of the parliament and one of the leaders of Liberal Democratic Party, which was a governing party for a number of years and now is in opposition, as you said, correctly. In this case, in my opinion, we see the clear and open attack on a party who is trying to oppose to what is going on to Moldova now, first, and second, that is a clear attack on the free media, because Yuriy Lutsenko is the founder and by recently the owner of an opposition TV channel, TV7, which now is administrated by a group of independent journalists. So, in my opinion, that is an attempt. We speak about the exponents of Liberal Party, who is not an opposition party for the moment. They declared that they are leaving the ruling coalition, but up to now they were the part of the governing coalition. A number of representatives of this Liberal Party, including the mayor of Chisinau, Dorin Kirpacă, were arrested. And investigations against them has started. We also cannot speak about the real delivering of the justice, because about the illegalities and the crimes in the municipal office of Chisinau, the people knew, and the press were spoken about that years ago. So why the prosecutors and the police started to work now? The explanation is that the liberals ceased to be the comfortable partners of Plahotniuc. Plahotniuc is the leader of Democratic Party, is a Moldovan tycoon, oligarch who, as everybody thinks in Moldova, control the state or state institutions in Moldova, including the justice, media, independent agencies, almost everything. So the Plahotniuc now has chosen in favor of the new partners, and we speak here about the Party of Socialists, the party whose leader is the President of Moldova, Bohdan.
Alexei, I'd like to interfere really to clarify that that's exactly becoming extremely confusing for the foreign audience, because Moldova has the new president who is Igor Dodon and who considered to be have this pro-Russian views. He had been the only leader who traveled to Moscow for the victory parade, for instance. At the same time, those kind of arrests in some of the opposition Moldovan press are connected to a different person, to this oligarch and also politician Plahotniuc. So there is a confusion, there is a president. So those arrests, who would be interested in them, and what are relations between Mr. Plahotniuc, the richest man in Moldova, and the current president, which has this kind of the pro-Russian views as it seems from outside?
The arrest will benefit normally the Plahotniuc, who, in my opinion, consolidate its power in Chisinau, eliminating, destroying the forces which theoretically or practically can fight the authoritarian tendencies in Moldova. And of course, this benefits also the socialists and Dodon, Igor Dodon, who is the president of Moldova, benefit the socialists also, because they would like to divide the country, or the spheres of the influence between these two parties, Democratic Party and Socialist Party, which means and show to everybody once again that Plahotniuc, for example, has no political preferences, and he can easily and quickly shift from pro-European slogans to pro-Russian slogans. And it also shows that Dodon is not, let's say, a real politician. He is an opportunist who can speculate on whatever geopolitical orientation, and can use in his lexic any slogans and topics and so on and so forth. So we have the case when two forces who has very little with the real politics, with the real interest for the country, try to take under the control the whole political spectrum, the whole country, and to govern in their own interest, to continue to steal the public monies and to share it with each other.
Also to mention, there were people arrested. They represent some kind of opposition or the opponents of the current political strongholders. Yet the cases of corruption had taken place, and there is no secret that there are a lot of government officials, were participating or were connected to different kinds of wrongdoings. And it's hard to believe that, the mayor of the city or the politician involved and connected to some kind of the governance were really sane and transparent. So really, what would you... And also there was another case, case of this called Landromat recently. So there is some kind of the movement to arrest the people regarding the, regarding this some kind of the level of corruption. What would you say on that? That those even opposition people are not really the same. If I'm not wrong.
Nobody is angel. That's true. And Plahotniuk and his prosecutors and policemen, judges, people he controls, they calculated very well their actions. The public knows that Kirtake, for example, who is the mayor of Chisinau, and his entourage, they were involved in the corruption acts, and a lot of tenders which took place in Chisinau were not transparent.
The first NATO summit with the US President Donald Trump. In his speech inaugurating the alliance's new headquarters, the American president could have singled out Russia as one of the main threats facing NATO. Yet, this wasn't the case. While the Central European governments expressed optimism that the United States remains committed to NATO, Hromadske's team has traveled to Brussels and focused on what the summit means for the region.
On the eve of the meeting in Brussels, Donald Trump managed to cheer up head NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg and his allies. President Trump suggested that Congress increase funding for U.S. troops in Europe by 40%. In practice, this will mean more military, more training, and better alliance infrastructure. On the square outside of the new NATO headquarters, attention was focused not just on the American president, but also on a newcomer to the team, French leader Emmanuel Macron. He and other members of the Group of Seven were hurrying to a summit in Sicily and didn't find time to speak to reporters. The press did, however, meet with Polish President Andrzej Duda.
On the subject of Russia's military exercises, which will start in the fall, near the eastern border of Poland is Belarus. It is a question of our security. NATO is vulnerable now, and it will follow the exercises closely.
Increased intelligence, the struggle with the Islamic State, increasing defense spending to 2% of GDP, and adding Montenegro to the ranks of NATO. These were the questions discussed at the meeting in Brussels. And they didn't forget about Russia.
Russia is on NATO's agenda always, and Russia will be discussed during the meeting later on today. Also as part of our discussions related to the transatlantic bond and burden sharing. Because one of the reasons why we are investing more in our collective defense, why we are increasing our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, is of course as a response to the aggressive actions of Russia we have seen in Ukraine.
Hromadske also asked NATO's Secretary General whether Ukraine is still on the agenda. It is known that Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron raised the Ukrainian question during dinner.
Еммануель Макрон порушували його під час вечері.
And we support also the economic sanctions of the European Union and United States and other countries. We are concerned about the lack of implementation of the Minsk agreements. We have seen many violations of the ceasefire, and we have seen that heavy weapons are not being withdrawn from the contact line. We are in particular concerned about that the international monitoring mission, the OSCE monitors, are not allowed to operate.
Is democracy in decline in Central and Eastern Europe? Hromadske starts a series looking closely at cases from a few countries. Today, in our focus is the Czech Republic, one of the first former East Bloc countries to join NATO. While its stance on Russia remains ambivalent, the country's energy sphere remains highly dependent on imports from Russia. Russian intelligence's presence in the Czech Republic is significant, and the country's intelligence services are aware of this issue. Our colleague Zhanna Bespetchuk talked to the famous Czech investigative journalist Andrej Kundra, the author of the recent book Putin's Agents.
Why, as you mentioned in your book, the Czech Republic has become the resident center for Russian security services in Central Eastern Europe?
Well, it has got more reasons. One, I would say it's a historical reason, because if you look on the size of Soviet embassy in Prague, and then now Russian embassy in Prague is one of the biggest one within the European Union and in Europe. It has got 120 employees. And if you look on it in a historical way, at the end of the 60s, when we had a democratic movement, which we called Prague Spring in my country, so one of the decision which was made by the chief of KGB, Andropov, how to fight against the democratic movement, was to make something what Russians call residentura, which is like dirty nest of full of agents on the Soviet embassy. And actually it was first residentura in the eastern and central bloc of the countries. And they were successful because in a fighting against the democratic oppositions, they win. One of the reasons is historically because until that time they stay in my country, and they had a lot of contacts and long tradition. The other reason I would say it's the Russians like my country because it's a safe place, it's a nice place, so it's also nice to be there.
Why did the Czech government and security services allow this?
Well, I think that they are trying to do something against it, especially last 2 years when the disinformation campaign is so strong. On the governmental level, there was said that we as a state need to fight against the disinformation campaign, so there was made the decision that under the interim minister they will be establish a new department which will be focused especially on fighting against disinformation. But on the other hand, I agree with you that we still don't do enough against it. If you look on the capacity of Czech counterintelligence service, on the department which is focused on Russian activities and Russian influence in my country, so the number of employees is 60 or 70. If you look on the capacity of the Russian embassy, and you know, as I said, that there is 120 employees, then Czech Secret Service doesn't have a chance to do enough. It's the problem of the decision by the government that not all of the politicians agree and think that this problem is strong and that we need to do something against it.
Who exactly doesn't agree with that? Which political parties?
Well, in each party, I would say you find some politicians. Some of them are pro-European, but some of them are more pro-Kremlin. Especially you can find those politicians within the ruling main party, Social Democrats, but also if you look on the Czech president, Zeman, he is very much pro-Russian. For example, he visited a couple of times conference on Rhodos Island, Dialogue of Civilization, which is conference which is run by Yakunin, Vladimir Yakunin, the guy from the inner circle of Vladimir Putin. And the visit of Czech president was paid by Russian state, and at the same time Czech president had their speech and he was talking in Russian against the sanction. So some of the politicians like he are doing this dirty and nasty policy.
And what do you see in terms of trends that dominate now? Other activities of Russian security services on rise, taking into consideration the events of the last 3 years in the European Union and, for example, in Ukraine?
This new trend is that the government decides to fight against the disinformation campaign, but still they are at the beginning of this process. And I would say that at the same time Kremlins are trying to use my country as a Troy horse within the European Union. If you look, for example, on the sanctions against Russia because of the war against Ukraine and Crimea. So, for example, the Kremlins are trying to persuade some of the Czech politicians to open this question on the European Union level in that way.
Did you get any reactions, response from Russia? For example, from Russian embassy in the Czech Republic?
Not from the Russian embassy, and it's more because of my normal work for my magazine, because I'm covering this issue also in my magazine. So I had the reactions that they publish my address where I'm living, and they written in one pro-Russian website, and they're written there that this bastard is living here, everybody can visit him. A couple of times the Russian trolls wrote me that I need to be killed and those kind of threats.
We have looked at the Russian connections, but what about internal politics? Does Czech society really support this anti-democratic sentiment? Within the next year, there will be 2 elections, parliamentary in October and presidential in January. They might be pivotal to the Czech Republic's direction. We have also spoken to Josef Pazderka.
I think the elections will be in October, and this government will be one of the few Czech governments that run the whole period of 4 years. But there is a political crisis. I think it's already the start of the election campaign.
And what are these people's views on partnership with Ukraine and other partners in Eastern Europe?
I think in general, Ukraine has been described by these people as a burden, as something we don't need. It's an additional burden. We have our own internal problems. Europe has a problem with immigration, with other things. Don't care about Ukraine because it's an additional burden. That's the message of these people, of these populists.
Are people dissatisfied with democracy, and do they miss authoritarian leaders? Because, for example, Prime Minister upholds democratic values, but his polls are falling, his party polls are falling.
I think it's more general problem within Europe. We became more rich. We are kind of. We think that democracy and the open space doesn't need any special nurturing, any special activity, and that's wrong because democracy dies if you don't care about it. Open space is filled with violent, populist things if you don't fill them with good, positive things, and that's the situation we are in now. We realize that we have to take more care about this open democratic space. Otherwise, we lose to populists, to xenophobia, and it's pretty dangerous tendency. But I still think we have it in our hands. It deserves attention. It deserves activity, and if we don't invest in it, we're going to lose.
And how did Czech society react to Zeman's proposition to liquidate all the journalists because there are too many of them. What does it mean?
President Zeman and his spokesperson say that it was a joke. It didn't mean anything. But making such a bad joke in the presence of Vladimir Putin, it is a clear signal that something is wrong. Unfortunately, there's a significant group of President Zeman's supporters who simply don't care. They say it was a bad joke, it was a good joke, we don't care. And they are clearly focused on domestic issues, on some of the core issues that Zeman repeats: fear of immigration, fear of European Union, fear of economic instability, whatever. And they don't care for anything else.
News about wounded civilians is coming regularly from eastern Ukraine's front line today. Official Ukrainian sources say about 8 were wounded in the town of Krasnohorivka, while a week ago a similar situation occurred in another town of Avdiivka, where people were killed. There is a certain fatigue from the media and society in getting used to the killing. Yet Hromadske stays on the story and recently traveled to Avdiivka to report on the orphans there.
The locals call this area Old Avdiivka. It's the place which is most often shelled during the shootings. On the 13th of May, this building was shelled. She was sitting outside with friends. The 2 children were playing inside. The shells landed just on the veranda, and 4 people died here. The children were orphaned. The day after their mother's funerals, orphaned girls Zhenya and Sasha go to the social services of Avdiivka to fill out custody documents. My sister only came here to meet with friends, to chat. That's when it happened. The weather was good, we sat in the courtyard. Irina, the cousin of the deceased, now had to look after her niece, Zhenya, and her grandparents. They are Russian citizens and have permission to stay and live in the occupied Khartits. They are now going to live in Avdiivka. The heating is broken, the boiler is gone, the gas is broken. It's impossible to live here. The authorities have patronized us from day one. I filled out her documentation. I'm a grandmother. I will have custody over her. She has no parents, no father. Her mother was a single parent. Because my mother is dead. She was a witness. The grandmother of the other girl, Sasha, worked in Avdiivka as a cleaner. She is Sasha's closest relative. She doesn't expect any help, and as she tells the journalists, she doesn't want it either. I want the child to live in normal conditions, without any explosions. All the glass has been shattered. The story of these 2 women is not unique. Since the beginning of the year, 5 civilians have died in Avdiivka, and more than 1,000 buildings have been destroyed. There isn't time to help everyone. There isn't any consistent help. The city sometimes helps provide building materials, but it's not enough. Our organisation gave $76 for families with young children. But the children need psychological help. They are currently in a difficult state. There is only money in the local budget for building materials. Financial assistance for families of those injured and killed has not yet been provided by the state. We are now going to help the families that suffered during the shelling. When Zhenya and Sasha's relatives were given custody of the children, the Avdiivka Military Civilian Administration decided to help the families. They have not managed to leave Avdiivka yet.
We'd like to draw your attention to another rare story from eastern Ukraine. The ongoing economic blockade of the Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine takes a toll on the lives of thousands of people trapped in the war-torn region. Russian-backed separatists took over the administration of local Ukrainian companies in early 2017. Since then, the legal owners have ceased paying staff salaries. Currently, all trade with the uncontrolled part of Donbas has been suspended. Hromadske traveled to Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine to find out what is really happening in the occupied factories and mines, and how the future looks for their employees. Read this story on our webpage, and with this, from me, Andriy Kulikov, and the entire team of Hromadske International, until next week, goodbye.